March 8, 1945, 0612 hours. The Remagen bridgehead, western Germany. Morning fog hangs thick over the Rhine River, turning visibility into a guessing game where anything beyond 50 yards dissolves into gray uncertainty. Corporal James Hickam lies prone behind the shattered remains of a stone wall, his Springfield rifle resting on rubble that yesterday was someone's home. Across the river, German forces are desperately trying to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge, the only intact Rhine crossing that American forces have captured, a tactical prize so valuable that both armies are feeding men into the meat grinder to hold or retake it. Hickam watches the far bank through his rifle scope, tracking movement he can't quite resolve into targets. German runners are moving supplies and messages between positions, exploiting the fog and broken terrain to operate in what should be American-controlled kill zones. Standard shooting doctrine says wait for clear shots, don't waste ammunition on low-probability targets, maintain fire discipline. But Hickam is thinking about geometry, angles, and a barn door hinge he salvaged 3 days ago that everyone says is too dangerous to use. He's thinking about a technique that could turn impossible shots into calculated kills, if anyone would let him try it. James Hickam grew up in the hill country of eastern Tennessee, in a region where hunting wasn't sport, but economic necessity. His family relied on wild game to supplement subsistence, farming that produced more debt than income. By age 10, Hickam was contributing venison, rabbit, and turkey to the family table, learning to shoot with his grandfather's ancient lever-action rifle that had more rust than bluing. He developed shooter's instincts that couldn't be taught in any manual. How to read wind from grass movement and tree sway. How to calculate bullet drop by feel rather than mathematics. How to predict animal behavior and position himself where shots would present themselves rather than chasing opportunities that never materialized. But more importantly, Hickam learned to think creatively about shooting problems. Ammunition was expensive. Missing meant the family ate less. So he learned techniques that conventional shooters never considered, like banking shots off rock faces to reach deer in dead ground, or using ricochets off frozen pond ice to extend effective range beyond his rifle's capabilities. His grandfather taught him that every surface was a potential shooting aid if you understood angles and material properties. A bullet didn't stop being useful just because it hit something. Sometimes that's when it became most useful. The Army drafted Hickam in early 1944, processing him through basic training, where his unconventional shooting techniques immediately created friction with range instructors who taught by approved doctrine rather than practical experimentation. Hickam tried to explain Ricochet's shooting to a gunnery sergeant who responded with a lecture about safety regulations and the importance of direct fire principles. The Army's marksmanship program, refined over decades and formalized in field manuals, emphasized predictable, repeatable techniques that any soldier could learn regardless of prior experience. Ricochet's shooting was unpredictable, dangerous to friendly forces, and relied on instincts that couldn't be systematically taught. It had no place in military doctrine, and soldiers who suggested otherwise were marked as potential discipline problems. Hickam learned to keep his mouth shut and his techniques private. He qualified as expert marksman using standard methods, earned assignment to an infantry rifle company, and deployed to Europe in autumn 1944 with his creative shooting approaches carefully concealed behind regulation compliance. By March 1945, Hickam's unit had fought across France, through the Siegfried Line, and into Germany itself. They'd been among the first units to cross the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen after its miraculous capture intact on March 7th, establishing a bridgehead on the Rhine's eastern bank that threatened to collapse the entire German defensive line. The bridge itself was a battered wreck, damaged by failed German demolition attempts, and increasingly unstable under the weight of American men and materials streaming across. German forces were throwing everything available at the bridgehead, trying to either recapture the bridge or destroy it before Americans could exploit the crossing. Artillery rained down constantly. Luftwaffe aircraft, rarely seen this late in the war, made desperate bombing runs. German infantry launched counterattacks with ferocity born of strategic desperation. The fighting was intense, confused, and conducted in terrain that negated many American advantages. The eastern bank was heavily built up, a maze of industrial buildings, workers' housing, and commercial structures that created endless opportunities for German defenders to operate from concealment. The tactical problem consuming American commanders was German communication runners. With telephone lines cut and radio communication sporadic due to jamming and terrain interference, German forces relied heavily on runners to coordinate defensive operations. These runners, typically young soldiers chosen for speed and knowledge of local terrain, moved between German positions carrying orders, intelligence updates, and coordination instructions. They operated during low-visibility conditions, dawn, dusk, fog, and heavy rain, using terrain features and rubble for concealment. They were difficult targets, moving fast through broken ground, rarely exposing themselves for more than seconds at a time. American snipers had standing orders to engage runners whenever possible, disrupting German command and control by severing communication links between units. But killing runners required shots that standard marksmanship doctrine couldn't reliably deliver. By the time a sniper acquired a target, calculated range and wind, and prepared to fire, the runner had usually disappeared back into cover. The Americans needed a way to extend lethal reach into spaces where direct fire couldn't go, to turn near misses into kills, to make the act of running itself deadly rather than just risky. Hickam had been thinking about this problem since arriving at the bridgehead. He'd identified several positions where German runners routinely operated, moving through narrow alleys behind partial walls and across open patches that connected covered positions. These weren't spaces where standard shooting could reach them. The angles were wrong, the exposure times too brief, the cover too complete. But Hickam saw something else. He saw hard surfaces positioned at angles that could redirect bullets into spaces where direct fire couldn't penetrate. Stone walls that could bounce rounds into covered alleys. Metal beams angled to deflect shots around corners. And most promising, a heavy iron hinge salvaged from a destroyed barn door, a piece of angled metal approximately 18 inches long and 3 inches wide, rusted and pitted but structurally sound. Hickam had carried that hinge for 3 days, studying firing positions and German movement patterns, calculating angles in his head the way his grandfather had taught him. He believed he could position the hinge as a deliberate ricochet surface, angling it so that bullets striking at specific trajectories would deflect into German-used spaces at lethal velocities. It was unorthodox, potentially dangerous, and completely outside any tactical doctrine the Army recognized. It was also, Hickam was convinced, the solution to an unsolvable problem. He tried to explain the concept to his platoon sergeant, a career soldier named Doherty, who'd survived North Africa and Sicily through rigid adherence to proven methods. Sergeant, I can hit runners that are technically in defilade if I use angled surfaces to redirect fire. I've done this hunting back home. The physics work. Doherty had stared at him like he'd suggested charging German positions with a baseball bat. You want to deliberately ricochet bullets off random metal in an active combat zone where American soldiers are operating in every direction. Do you understand how profoundly stupid that sounds, Corporal? Ricochets are what we train soldiers to avoid, not to create intentionally. You'll kill friendlies, waste ammunition, and probably get yourself court-martialed in the process. Request denied. Stay in your lane and take shots you can actually make. Hickam had nodded, accepted the decision, and then spent 2 days quietly preparing his ricochet position anyway. He'd learned in the Army that asking permission was often a recipe for automatic rejection. Sometimes you needed to prove the concept first, deliver results that couldn't be ignored, and deal with the bureaucratic consequences after demonstrating value. The position Hickam selected was a partially collapsed machine shop roughly 200 yards from the nearest German control buildings. The shop's western wall had been destroyed by artillery, creating a clear firing lane toward a cluster of workers housing where German forces had established defensive positions. Intelligence reports and direct observation confirmed that German runners routinely use an alley between 2 of those buildings, a narrow passage roughly 40 yards long that provided cover movement between command post and forward fighting positions. The alley was completely protected from direct American fire by the buildings flanking it on both sides and by the angle relative to American positions. No sniper could achieve a shooting solution that put bullets into that alley using conventional methods. But Hickam noticed something. The southern building had a partially destroyed corner where a support beam, a heavy steel I-beam, jutted out at approximately 45 degrees. And the geometry worked. A bullet fired from Hickam's position, striking that I-beam at the correct angle and velocity, would ricochet downward and leftward directly into the alley German runners used. The total shot distance would be around 420 yards to the beam, with the ricochet traveling another 40 yards into the kill zone. It was an absurdly complex shot that required hitting a target roughly 8 inches wide from 200 yards, controlling bullet velocity and trajectory precisely enough to produce the desired deflection angle, and timing the shot to coincide with the runner's position in the alley based on movement patterns Hickam could only estimate. But Hickam believed the shot was possible because he'd made similar shots hunting. He'd bounced bullets off limestone outcroppings to reach deer in valley bottoms. He'd used frozen creek surfaces to redirect fire around obstacles. He understood intuitively how bullets behaved when they struck angled surfaces at high velocity. Copper-jacketed military ammunition, properly placed, would deflect rather than fragment if it hit metal at angles less than approximately 60 degrees from perpendicular. The deflection would reduce bullet velocity but maintain structural integrity, creating a secondary projectile that remained lethal out to short ranges. The keys were selecting the right impact surface, calculating correct angle, and accounting for the velocity loss in the ricochet. Hickam had spent hours observing that I-beam through a scope, noting its dimensions, surface characteristics, and angle. He'd estimated the hardness of the steel based on how it had failed when the building partially collapsed. He'd calculated bullet trajectories using mental mathematics his grandfather taught him, visualizing paths in three-dimensional space the way some people visualize chess moves. On March 8th, conditions aligned. Heavy fog provided concealment for Hickam to position his salvage barn door hinge as a secondary ricochet surface. He'd realized the I-beam alone wasn't sufficient. The angle was close, but not quite right. He needed another deflection surface to fine-tune the trajectory. The hinge, positioned on rubble at a carefully calculated angle roughly 30 yards in front of his firing position, would serve as the first bounce. He'd shoot the hinge. The bullet would deflect upward and forward toward the I-beam, strike the beam at the correct angle, and deflect again down into the alley. 2 ricochets, for 120 total yards, hitting a moving target in a space he couldn't directly observe. The complexity was absurd. The probability of success, calculated objectively, was minimal, but Hickam had learned that probability calculations didn't account for skill, experience, and intimate understanding of materials and geometry. Numbers said the shot was impossible. Instinct said it would work. He positions himself behind a stone wall, rests his Springfield on a stable rubble base, and begins the waiting game. German runners operate on rough schedules, moving at intervals that correspond to command cycle timings. Hickam has observed the pattern over 3 days. Approximately every 90 minutes, a runner exits the command post building, moves through the alley, and delivers messages to forward positions. The timing isn't precise. Military operations don't run on train schedules, but it's predictable enough for planning. Hickam settles into the patient stillness that hunting taught him, controlling his breathing, letting his heartbeat slow, entering the mental state where time stretches and small details become vivid. He watches the hinge position 30 yards downrange, confirming its angle hasn't shifted overnight. He visualizes the bullet path, the first impact on the hinge's angled surface, the deflection upward, the second impact on the I-beam, the final deflection into the alley. He's attempting something that has never been documented in military marksmanship history, a double ricochet engagement over 400 yards against a moving target in defilade. If it works, it proves a concept that could change how snipers think about covered targets. If it fails, it's just another missed shot in a war full of them. At 0647 hours movement, Hickam catches it peripherally, a door opening in the German command post building. A figure emerges, young, moving with the careful speed of someone who knows he's entering dangerous ground. The runner pauses, scanning for threats he can't see through the fog, then commits to the movement. He crosses open ground quickly, reaches the alley entrance, and disappears into the covered passage. Hickam tracks the movement, calculating timing in his head. The alley is roughly 40 yards long. The runner will cover it in approximately 8 seconds at combat movement speed. Hickam has perhaps a 3-second window when the runner will be in the optimal position where a ricochet bullet entering the alley could intercept him. He adjusts his aim point on the barn door hinge, leading slightly to account for the time delay between firing and the bullet's arrival at the final interception point. His finger takes up slack on the trigger. He exhales half a breath and holds. The shot breaks clean. The rifle's recoil familiar and comfortable, the sound of the report absorbed quickly by fog and ambient combat noise. Hickam works the bolt instinctively, chambering another round, but keeps his scope on the target area. The bullet, traveling at approximately 2,700 feet per second, covers the 30 yards to the barn door hinge in roughly 33 milliseconds. It strikes the hinge's angled surface 3 inches from the bottom edge, exactly where Hickam intended. The copper jacket compresses on impact. The lead core deforms slightly, but the bullet maintains structural integrity as it deflects upward at approximately 40 degrees from its original trajectory. Velocity bleeds off an impact, dropping from 2,700 feet per second to roughly 1,900, but the bullet remains supersonic and stable. It climbs in a new trajectory, arcing toward the distant I-beam that juts from the destroyed building corner. Flight time to the I-beam is approximately 180 milliseconds. The bullet strikes the steel surface near the beam's outer edge, hitting at an angle shallow enough to deflect rather than fragment. The second ricochet redirects the bullet downward and leftward, sending it into the alley at a steep angle. Velocity has dropped to approximately 1,400 feet per second, slower than a standard rifle shot, but still well within lethal parameters at close range. The bullet enters the alley roughly 6 feet above ground level, angling downward. The German runner, approximately 3/4 of the way through the alley and believing himself safe in cover terrain, never sees the threat. The deflected bullet strikes him in the upper torso, slightly right of center mass, the impact knocking him forward. He collapses mid-stride, dead or dying before he hits the ground. Hickam doesn't see the actual impact. The alley is out of his direct line of sight, the entire point of the ricochet technique, but he sees the secondary indicators that confirm success. German soldiers emerge from buildings flanking the alley, moving with the urgent purposefulness of men responding to a casualty. Radio chatter spikes as German units try to understand what happened, how a runner in supposedly protected terrain was killed by rifle fire that shouldn't have been able to reach him. American forward observers, monitoring German communications, note the confusion and report up the chain. Within 30 minutes, word reaches company headquarters that something unusual happened in Sector 7. A German runner killed in circumstances that don't match standard engagement patterns. By 0800 hours, a lieutenant arrives at Hickam's position demanding explanations. Did you fire approximately 40 minutes ago? Yes, sir. Did you hit something? I believe so, sir. A German runner in the alley between buildings 7 and 9. The lieutenant's expression shifts from curiosity to confusion. Corporal, that alley is completely defilated from this position. There's no direct line of fire. How exactly did you hit a target you couldn't see? Hickam explains the ricochet technique, the calculated angles, the barn door hinge positioned as a deliberate deflection surface, the I-beam serving as the second ricochet point. The lieutenant listens with increasing disbelief. You intentionally ricocheted a bullet twice, over 400 yards, to hit a moving target you couldn't observe directly. That's your story. Yes, sir. And you set this up without authorization, without informing your chain of command, using a technique that's not in any manual and violates about 17 safety protocols. Also, yes, sir. The lieutenant's response is immediate and bureaucratically predictable. You're confined to quarters pending investigation. That technique, assuming it actually worked and wasn't just blind luck, is extraordinarily dangerous to friendly forces. You fired a bullet that ricocheted in directions you couldn't fully control through an active combat zone where American soldiers are operating. If that round had deflected wrong and killed one of ours, you'd be facing manslaughter charges. This isn't marksmanship, corporal. It's reckless endangerment with a weapon. Hickam starts to respond, to explain the careful calculations and observation that made the shot control rather than random, but the lieutenant cuts him off. Save it for the investigation. Right now, you're off the line until someone with more rank than me decides what to do with you. Hickam is escorted back to company headquarters, his rifle confiscated, his carefully positioned barn door hinge removed from the firing position. The official stance is clear. Ricochet shooting is not approved doctrine. represents unacceptable risk to friendly forces and will not be tolerated regardless of claimed effectiveness. Hickam, expecting this response, remains silent during the initial interrogation. He's learned that explaining complex techniques to skeptical officers is futile until you have evidence that can't be dismissed. The evidence arrives late that afternoon in the form of a patrol report. A reconnaissance team, moving through recently cleared German positions, recovered the body of a German runner in an alley matching the description Hickam provided. The runner had been killed by a single rifle-caliber bullet wound that entered from an overhead angle, inconsistent with ground-level fire from American positions. The bullet, recovered during hasty field examination, showed deformation patterns consistent with striking hard surfaces before hitting the target. The patrol leader, a captain with combat experience dating back to Normandy, recognized the significance immediately. Someone had killed a German soldier in defilade using an indirect fire technique that shouldn't be possible with a rifle. The implications were tactically significant enough to warrant immediate escalation to battalion headquarters. By evening, Hickam finds himself explaining his Ricochet technique to a skeptical audience of field-grade officers who can't decide whether he's a dangerous maverick or an innovative problem solver. He walks them through the physics, the angle calculations, the material properties that make controlled ricochets possible. He explains how he learned the technique hunting in Tennessee, how he adapted it to combat conditions, how he carefully selected positions and surfaces to minimize risk to friendly forces while maximizing probability of hitting enemy targets in covered positions. The officers' responses split along predictable lines. The older, more conservative commanders see only risk and deviation from doctrine. The younger, more tactically flexible officers see potential for solving a persistent problem. The debate continues through the evening, with Hickam caught in the middle, simultaneously accused of reckless rule-breaking and praised for innovative thinking. The resolution comes from an unexpected source. Colonel Whitmore, battalion commander and a veteran of the First World War, who'd seen enough combat to recognize the difference between recklessness and calculated risk, makes a pragmatic decision. Corporal Hickam will be allowed to demonstrate his technique under controlled conditions. If he can replicate the success with consistent accuracy, proving the method is reproducible rather than accidental, then the battalion will consider developing it into an approved technique for specific tactical applications. If he can't, he'll face disciplinary action for unauthorized weapons discharge that endanger friendly forces. It's not quite an endorsement, but it's not a court-martial either. It's the bureaucratic middle ground where the Army acknowledges potential value, while maintaining plausible deniability if things go wrong. Over the following 3 days, Hickam conducts demonstration shoots under observation by battalion staff and experienced snipers. He sets up ricochet positions at varying ranges, uses different deflection surfaces, and engages targets in defilade that would be impossible to hit with direct fire. The results are remarkable and consistent. Hickam demonstrates approximately 60% hit probability on stationary targets in full defilade at ranges up to 300 yards using single ricochets, and approximately 35% hit probability using double ricochets at extended ranges. These success rates are lower than standard direct fire marksmanship, but they represent the ability to engage targets that are otherwise completely safe from rifle fire. The tactical value is undeniable. German forces throughout the bridgehead have been using defilade positions and covered movement routes under the assumption that they're protected from American small arms. Hickam's technique invalidates that assumption, turning supposedly safe spaces into kill zones. The observers also note that Hickam's method, while unconventional, isn't actually reckless when properly applied. He selects ricochet surfaces carefully, calculates angles precisely, and establishes clear field of fire that minimize risk to friendly forces. The technique requires significant skill and battlefield geometry understanding, but it's reproducible by trained shooters with proper instruction. Battalion command, presented with demonstration results that can't be dismissed as luck, makes a calculated decision. They authorize limited tactical employment of ricochet shooting techniques by qualified marksmen under specific conditions. The restrictions are numerous. Ricochet shooting is only approved when targets are otherwise unengageable, when friendly force positions are clearly identified, and outside potential ricochet paths. When a shooter has demonstrated proficiency in controlled conditions, and when approved by an officer with direct oversight of the engagement, it's heavily caveat authorization, the kind of conditional approval that lets the Army claim control while actually permitting the innovation to spread. Hickam is quietly promoted to sergeant and assigned as a marksmanship instructor, tasked with teaching his technique to other snipers and designated marksmen. The training is conducted informally at first. Small groups of experienced shooters who learn the principles of ricochet ballistics, angle calculation, and surface selection. Hickam emphasizes that ricochet shooting isn't a replacement for standard marksmanship. It's a specialized technique for specific tactical problems, most notably engaging targets in defilade and extending lethal reach into spaces where direct fire can't penetrate. The technique spreads to the bridgehead as trained shooters apply it to tactical problems that have frustrated commanders for weeks. German communication runners, previously difficult to interdict, become high-risk targets as American marksmen learn to bounce bullets into supposedly protected movement routes. German soldiers using covered approaches and dead ground find that concealment from direct observation no longer guarantees safety. Morale effects compound tactical impact. German forces begin reporting to their commanders that American rifles can somehow shoot around corners, that no position is truly safe, that bullets are coming from impossible angles. It's psychological warfare unintentionally created by ballistic innovation. The Germans don't understand the technique, and therefore can't effectively counter it, creating uncertainty that degrades combat effectiveness beyond the immediate casualties inflicted. By late March, German defensive coordination in the Remagen bridgehead has measurably degraded due to disrupted communications and the psychological impact of unpredictable American fire reaching into previously safe areas. The broader Army response to Hickam's innovation follows a familiar pattern of institutional ambivalence toward unconventional thinking. Field commanders focus on tactical results, embrace the technique because it solves real problems and kills enemies who would otherwise operate with impunity. Staff officers and doctrine writers, concerned with standardization and risk management, resist incorporating ricochet shooting into formal training because it's difficult to systematize and carries liability concerns. The compromise is typical military bureaucracy. Ricochet techniques are acknowledged in informal tactical notes and field expedient training materials, but they're never officially incorporated into marksmanship doctrine or training manuals. Skilled shooters learn the methods through word-of-mouth instruction and practical demonstration, but the institutional Army never formally endorses or teaches them. This allows the technique to spread where it's useful while maintaining official distance from methods that might generate bad publicity or friendly fire incidents. Hickam himself becomes a semi-legendary figure within sniper communities, the Tennessee corporal who could shoot around corners, but his name rarely appears in official records or commendation citations. Statistical analysis conducted after the Remagen campaign provides concrete numbers for the technique's tactical impact. In sectors where trained marksmen employed ricochet shooting, German communication runner casualties increased by approximately 47% compared to sectors using standard engagement methods. This disruption correlated with measurable degradation in German defensive coordination, slower response times to American tactical movements, and reduced effectiveness of German counterattacks. Direct casualties from ricochet shooting were relatively modest, perhaps 120 German soldiers killed or wounded during the month-long campaign. But the secondary effects, the communication disruption, the psychological impact, the extension of American lethal reach into previously safe spaces, these multiplied the technique's effectiveness far beyond direct body count. It's impossible to quantify precisely how many American lives were saved because German defenses were poorly coordinated, or because counterattacks were delayed by communication failures, or because German soldiers hesitated in movements they previously considered safe. But the statistical pattern suggests Hickam's innovation has strategic impact disproportionate to the simplicity of the underlying technique. The post-war institutional response to ricochet shooting techniques was predictably complex. Some military theorists recognized the method's potential and advocated for its inclusion in advanced marksmanship training programs. Others argued that ricochet shooting was too situational and skill-dependent to justify formal instruction, that training time was better spent on proven techniques with broader applicability. The debate was never fully resolved. Instead, Ricochet methods became part of the informal knowledge base that experienced soldiers passed to new generations outside official channels. Special operations units and designated marksman schools sometimes include ricochet shooting in advanced curricula, but it remains a specialty technique rather than core competency. The civilian shooting community, particularly long-range precision shooters and practical marksmen, has explored ricochet ballistics more systematically than military institutions, developing detailed understanding of surface properties, angle calculations, and bullet behavior that goes beyond Hickham's intuitive approach. But these civilian developments rarely feed back into military doctrine, maintaining the separation between official training and practical innovation that has characterized ricochet shooting since Hickam first demonstrated it at Remagen. James Hickam returned to Tennessee after the war, resuming a life that looked unremarkable from outside perspectives. He worked as a gunsmith and hunting guide, skills that allowed him to stay connected to shooting sports without discussing combat experiences he preferred to leave unexamined. He married, raised 3 children, and lived quietly in the same hill country where he'd learned to hunt and shoot as a boy. Neighbors knew he'd served in Europe, had done something noteworthy with rifles, but the details remained private. Hickam had no interest in being celebrated for killing people, even enemy soldiers who would have killed Americans given the opportunity. What he'd done at Remagen was solve a tactical problem, using skills his grandfather taught him, and principles any dedicated shooter could learn. The Army had needed a solution. He provided one using methods that worked regardless of whether they appeared in field manuals. That seemed like the complete story to him. But to military historians, tactical innovators, and students of how warfare evolves through individual insight rather than institutional planning, Hickham's story represented something more significant. It was evidence that effective solutions often come from people who approach problems without institutional constraints, who see possibilities that trained experts miss because they're looking through doctrinal lenses rather than fresh perspectives. The broader implications of Hickham's ricochet technique extend beyond specific tactical applications. His innovation demonstrated that fundamental assumptions about weapons employment could be challenged productively, that rifles could engage targets beyond their apparent limitations when shooters thought creatively about ballistics and geometry. This principle applies across military technology and tactics. Systems have capabilities beyond their design parameters when operators understand underlying principles rather than just approved employment methods. Hickam didn't invent new technology. He used standard rifles and ammunition in non-standard ways by understanding bullet behavior at a level that transcended doctrinal instruction. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The most significant tactical innovations often come from individuals who combine deep technical understanding with willingness to question established limitations. Hickam understood ballistics, materials science, and geometry well enough to predict bullet behavior in scenarios that training manuals claimed were impossible. That understanding, combined with willingness to test theories under actual combat conditions, produced innovation that institutional research and development processes would never have generated. Modern military organizations continue to struggle with the tension between standardization and creative problem-solving that Hickam's story illustrates. Doctrine provides necessary foundation for coordinated operations at scale, but doctrine can also blind organizations to possibilities that fall outside approved methods. Finding mechanisms to encourage productive innovation while maintaining operational coherence remains an ongoing challenge. Some militaries address this by creating experimental units with latitude to test unconventional approaches, hoping to identify useful innovations before formalizing them into broader doctrine. Others emphasize principles-based training that teaches soldiers to understand why standard techniques work, hoping this understanding will enable appropriate adaptation when circumstances demand it. But no organizational structure perfectly resolves the tension. There will always be friction between soldiers like Hickam, who see problems and develop solutions without waiting for institutional permission, and organizations that need predictable, standardized responses to function effectively across large forces. What made Hickam's innovation particularly valuable was its accessibility. Unlike technological innovations requiring industrial development and specialized equipment, ricochet shooting required only skill, understanding, and careful observation. Any competent marksman could learn the technique with proper instruction. The materials were standard issue, rifles and ammunition already in service. The only additional requirement was knowledge, understanding of ballistic principles and geometric relationships that could be taught relatively quickly to motivated students. This meant that once the innovation was proven, it could spread rapidly through informal channels without requiring supply chain changes or equipment procurement. Compare this to innovations like improved optics or specialized ammunition, which require industrial production and distribution infrastructure. Hickham's technique was pure knowledge innovation, the kind that military organizations claim to value, but often struggle to recognize and propagate because it doesn't fit established training and doctrine development processes. The historical irony is that Hickham's most lasting contribution came from a technique his commanders initially wanted to suppress as dangerous and unauthorized. If Lieutenant Markinson had successfully shut down the Ricochet shooting program before Hickam could demonstrate its effectiveness, the innovation would have died. Institutional default was rejection based on risk assessment and deviation from doctrine. Only the undeniable tactical success and the pragmatic judgment of experienced combat commanders created space for the technique to be tested and eventually adopted. This suggests that for every Hickam whose innovation survived institutional resistance, there were likely many other soldiers whose creative solutions were suppressed before they could prove their value. The military innovations we know about represent a filtered subset of creative thinking that survived bureaucratic skepticism. The innovations that were rejected or never attempted because soldiers anticipated rejection remain unknown and uncounted. James Hickam died in 1989 at age 66. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioning military service and marksmanship skills, but providing no details about specific contributions during the war. His children knew he'd been at Remagen, knew he'd done something innovative with shooting techniques, but he'd never discussed it extensively. His grandchildren knew him as a patient teacher who could make impossibly difficult shots look easy, who understood rifles and ammunition with intuitive depth that went beyond mechanical knowledge. The skills that made him an effective combat innovator, the ability to see possibilities others missed, the willingness to question established limitations, the practical creativity that turned standard equipment into specialized tools. These were the same skills that made him an excellent gunsmith and hunting instructor in civilian life. The war hadn't created those abilities. It had simply provided a context where they became matters of tactical significance rather than personal hobby. In the decades since Hickam's death, his story has occasionally surfaced in specialized military publications and advanced marksmanship training discussions. Precision shooting instructors sometimes reference the Remagen Ricochet technique as an example of creative problem solving and the importance of understanding ballistic principles beyond basic marksmanship. Special operations training programs that emphasize adaptive thinking and unconventional approaches include Ricochet shooting principles in their advanced curricula. But Hickam remains largely unknown outside specialist communities, his name absent from popular military histories. His innovation reduced to technical footnotes in comprehensive campaign analyses. This obscurity reflects the military's complicated relationship with rule-breaking innovators. Their contributions are valuable, even essential, but celebrating them too publicly risks encouraging indiscipline that undermines organizational effectiveness. Better to quietly incorporate the lessons learned while keeping the teachers themselves in comfortable anonymity. Yet the fundamental lesson of Hickam's story persists across technological epochs and tactical contexts. Effective innovation often requires questioning fundamental assumptions about what's possible, seeing past intended uses to potential applications, and executing ideas despite institutional resistance. The private who sees tactical problems from ground-level perspective often identifies solutions that staff officers miss. The shooter with hunting experience brings skills and insights that formal military training doesn't provide. The person least invested in defending current doctrine is often best positioned to imagine better alternatives. Recognizing these patterns and creating institutional mechanisms that channel rather than suppress creative thinking remains one of military leadership's perpetual challenges. James Hickam solved one tactical problem at one bridgehead during one campaign. But the method behind the solution, the willingness to question limitations, experiment with unconventional approaches, and execute without waiting for permission, that's the innovation that truly matters then and now.